Welcome to Sleep Storyteller. It was just past midnight when the first call came. I remember because I had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. Sleep had been hard to come by lately. Too many late nights, too much coffee, and too many thoughts circling my head like vultures. I had been trying to convince myself to close my eyes when the sound pierced the silence, my phone ringing on the nightstand. At first, I didn't think much of it. Wrong numbers happen all the time. But something about the sound felt off. Maybe it was because no one ever called me at that hour. My friends knew I hated late-night calls, and my family would only call if it was an emergency. My stomach twisted with the thought of bad news. I leaned over, squinting at the glowing screen. That was when I froze. The caller ID displayed my own number. For a moment, I thought it had to be a mistake, a glitch. Maybe the phone company messing up some signal. But it kept ringing, the vibration rattling against the wood of the nightstand. My thumb hovered over the decline button, then shifted toward answer. A strange curiosity crept over me. Who would be on the other end? I hesitated for one ring too many. Then I swiped and held the phone to my ear. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Nothing. There was no one on the line. Only a deep, droning static, like the sound of an old TV with no signal. I pulled the phone back, checked the screen again. Still my own number. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, pale and tired. "Hello?" I repeated, louder this time. That was when I heard it. A whisper, faint and fleeting, woven into the static. I couldn't make out the words at first, but it was definitely a voice. I strained my ears, pressing the phone harder against my ear until it hurt. "Hello?" It was my own voice. I pulled the phone away so fast I almost dropped it. My heart hammered in my chest, blood rushing so loudly that I thought I might pass out. My own voice. I knew it wasn't just my imagination. It had the same tone, the same inflection, as if I had spoken into a recorder and played it back with the volume low. "Who is this?" I demanded, forcing my voice to steady. The line went dead. The silence in my room felt heavier than before, pressing against my ears, against my chest. I stared at the phone, half expecting it to start ringing again. It didn't. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it must have been some bizarre spoofing prank. I'd read once about scammers who could fake phone numbers, even make it look like the call was coming from your own device. That had to be it. Technology was weird, after all. And yet, I couldn't shake the sound of my voice. I set the phone down on the nightstand, face down, and pulled the blanket over my head like I had when I was a child afraid of monsters in the dark. My pulse thudded in my ears. Each beat reminded me of that static whisper. Eventually, exhaustion won over fear, and I drifted into a restless sleep. But deep inside, I knew something had shifted. The next day, I tried to act normal. Work was dull, my coworkers were as forgettable as ever, and I kept telling myself it had been nothing more than a glitch, a technical hiccup. Still, every time my phone buzzed with a notification, my stomach clenched. I didn't tell anyone. How could I? Hey, guess what? My own number called me and I heard my voice on the other end. They'd laugh. Or worse, they'd think I was losing my mind. Maybe I was. That night, I went to bed earlier, determined to sleep before any strange calls could come through. I set my phone to silent and placed it screen down, trying to bury the anxiety with routine. But at exactly 3:15 a.m., I woke up. Not from a dream, not from a noise, just awake. My eyes opened to darkness and my chest tightened before I even turned to look at the nightstand. The phone was ringing. The screen glowed faintly, illuminating the edges of the room, casting long shadows on the walls. And there it was again. The number displayed in bold white text. My number. The room seemed to grow colder, the air heavier, as I stared at it. My hand trembled as I reached toward the phone, then stopped just inches away. Part of me screamed not to answer. Part of me needed to. The ringing filled my head. My hand finally closed around the phone. I took a deep breath, pressed accept, and whispered into the dark. Hello? Hello? The word left my lips like a secret I wasn't supposed to share. The silence on the other end stretched, long and uncomfortable, and for a moment I thought maybe it would be the same as before, just static, just nothing. Then the sound returned, not just static this time, a voice. It was faint, muffled, distorted as though coming through layers of water, but undeniably a voice. Alex. I froze. My name. It said my name. I sat up in bed so quickly that the blanket slid off my shoulders and crumpled at my waist. The darkness of the room pressed closer, as if leaning in to listen. Who is this? I demanded, though my voice cracked, betraying my fear. The line hissed and crackled, the voice fading, then sharpening again. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, even though every instinct screamed to throw it away. I know you, the voice whispered. The sound was strange. It wasn't exactly my own voice this time, but it was close, like a sibling or someone who had practiced speaking the way I did. Too close to be a coincidence. I don't know who you are, but this isn't funny, I snapped. I wanted to sound angry, but my chest felt hollow, my throat tight. The voice chuckled softly, a sound broken by static. Then you don't remember, do you? I gritted my teeth. Remember what? You locked the window before you came to bed, the voice said. My blood ran cold. My head turned slowly toward the window across the room. The blinds were drawn, the frame shut tight. I had locked it earlier, hadn't I? I thought back, trying to picture the motion of turning the lock, but the memory slipped through my fingers like smoke. My hand began to shake. Stop it, whoever you are, stop this. The voice went silent for a few seconds, just the hum of static filling the air. Then, clear as a knife cutting through glass, it whispered, I'm already here. I nearly dropped the phone. My eyes darted around the room, heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. Nothing, just shadows, furniture, and the pale glow of the screen. I bolted out of bed and flicked on the light. My small bedroom flooded with the warm, familiar glow of the overhead bulb. Nothing was out of place. No one was there. I brought the phone back to my ear. The line was dead again. I hung up and set the phone down, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling. For a long while, I just stood there in the middle of my room, staring at the window, then the door, then the phone. Finally, I told myself it had to be a prank. Some hacker, some stupid scammer who knew too much. That had to be it. Maybe they were spoofing my number. Maybe they somehow had access to my personal details. There were 1,000 rational explanations. But deep down, the voice lingered in my mind, gnawing at me. I'm already here. The rest of the night, I left the lights on. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. And though the sun eventually rose, spilling light into my room, the words stayed with me like a splinter buried deep in my skin. Because I am you. By the third night, I'd convinced myself of two things. One, I wasn't imagining the calls. Two, I wasn't safe. I'd replayed the voice in my head so many times that it no longer felt like memory, but like something still alive, breathing softly just beneath my skin. Because I am you, the words gnawed at me every time the house grew quiet. Sleep became impossible. My eyes felt like sandpaper. My hands jittered with exhaustion. And yet I couldn't let myself drift off. What if I missed something? What if the phone rang and I didn't answer? On the third night, I set up a plan. I pulled my old tape recorder from the closet. It had been sitting there since college, dusty but functional. I placed it beside the phone on the nightstand, microphone aimed directly at the device. I figured if the calls came again, I'd have proof. I'd hear it back in the morning, play it for someone else if I needed to. Maybe then I wouldn't feel so insane. By 3 a.m., I was sitting upright in bed, staring at the glowing red light of the recorder. My heart hammered, each second dragging by like an eternity. And then, right on schedule, 3:15, the phone rang. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The screen glowed in the dark, displaying my own number. I hit record on the tape machine, then forced myself to answer. Hello? My voice trembled. The static came thick and heavy, like a storm pressed against the line. And then within it, I heard the whispering again. Not one voice this time, but many. They overlapped, tangled, words dissolving into one another like waves breaking against rocks. I couldn't make them out, not clearly. But my name was there, again and again, as though dozens of mouths spoke it in unison. Alex, Alex, Alex. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, my pulse thudding so loudly that I worried it would drown out the sound. What do you want? I whispered. The voices shifted, weaving together into a single hiss. Listen. Then came the sound of breathing, long, steady, ragged. Not mine, not from me. My stomach twisted into knots. Who are you? Static, whispers. Then, faintly, you'll see soon. The line went dead. I stared at the phone until the screen dimmed, leaving me in darkness again. My body was shaking so violently, I barely could set the phone down without dropping it. But the recorder. I had the recorder. Proof. With trembling hands, I pressed stop, then rewound the tape and pressed play. The room filled with the hollow hiss of static. My own voice, weak, trembling, asking questions. Then, faintly, the whispers. But this time, they were clearer. Without the live panic of the call rushing in my ears, I could hear the layers. Dozens of voices, yes, but threaded through the static in patterns, repeated names, dates, words. I leaned in, straining, goosebumps rising along my arms. And then I heard it. My mother's name, my father's, my best friend's, all spoken in that same broken chorus. I stopped the tape, rewound, and listened again. No mistake. Their names, whispered again and again, as though reciting a list. And at the very end, one more name. My own. I slammed the stop button so hard the recorder clattered to the floor. I sat frozen in the dark, my breath shallow, my skin damp with cold sweat. How could they know? How could it know? I didn't dare play the tape again. I shoved the recorder into the drawer and shut it as though closing a door on something poisonous. But the whispers lingered in my head, burned into me. The next day, I carried the weight of it with me like a stone in my chest. Every time I looked at another person, I thought of how their names had been spoken in that static, like promises. By nightfall, I was raw with fear and exhaustion. I didn't want to hear the phone ring again. I didn't want to know what new thing it would reveal. And yet, I couldn't stop myself. When the clock struck 3:15 a.m., I was already awake, already staring at the phone. It rang. And this time, I didn't hesitate. I answered. The voices came again, louder now, clearer, as though they were closer. "Alex," I swallowed hard. "Why are you doing this?" A pause. "Because you called first." The line went dead. I dropped the phone onto the bed, heart racing, chest heaving. My skin prickled with terror. "Because you called first." But I hadn't. I hadn't called anyone. I knew that with certainty. And yet, as I stared at the phone in the dark, one thought gnawed at me like teeth. What if I had? Sleep had become a fragile, fleeting thing, something I no longer trusted. Each night, I waited for the call, my heart pounding in my chest, my body tense as a drawn bow, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. It was 3:15 a.m., of course. My eyes snapped open to the familiar glow of my phone. My number was on the screen. My pulse throbbed so hard I thought it might burst through my ribs. I reached for the phone, hands shaking violently, and answered. "Hello?" I whispered. And then it spoke. But this time, it wasn't just my voice on the other end. It was me. Every inflection, every hesitation, every subtle quiver, it was perfect. The voice on the line mimicked me so exactly that I had to pinch myself, convinced I was dreaming. "Hello?" it said. I recoiled. Who is this?" There was a pause. Then, "I don't know. Who is this?" The words, the tone, they were my own. Every hesitation, every breath mirrored me perfectly. I dropped the phone and backed away from the bed, terror blooming in my chest like ice. "No, this isn't real," I muttered to myself. "It's very real," the voice replied, perfectly echoing my inflection. "Why are you scared?" I stumbled to the mirror across the room, my reflection pale and shaking. My hands clutched the edge of the dresser, knuckles white. And that's when I realized something that made my blood run cold. The reflection in the mirror didn't move the way I did. My hands raised, and its reflection hesitated a second too long before matching the motion. My lips parted, and its lips barely twitched in response like a faint shadow of my own words. I screamed, dropping to the floor. This isn't possible." "It is," the voice said. "I'm already here." My head shot up. The phone, still clutched in my hands, lit the room with its faint glow. I could see nothing, yet I felt it. Something shifting, moving in the corners of the room, too subtle to see, but too heavy to ignore. I crawled backward, pressing myself against the wall, staring at the mirror. My reflection smiled. A slow, deliberate, horrifying smile that I did not make. What are you?" I choked out, voice trembling. "I'm you," it said. "The real you. The one you've been ignoring. The one you've locked away. And now, it's time to wake up." I wanted to throw the phone, smash the mirror, anything, but my body refused. My hands shook violently, my knees were like jelly, and my chest constricted as if invisible hands were squeezing. And then the line went silent. I pressed the phone to my ear again, desperate, static, that same oppressive whispering static, and through it, faintly, I heard words forming. "Look closer." I forced myself to glance back at the mirror. The room was quiet. My reflection was normal again. Or maybe I was just imagining it, but I couldn't shake the memory of that smile, the one that didn't belong to me. I sank to the floor, clutching my knees, trying to steady my racing thoughts. Every logical explanation I tried to cling to fell apart. Spoofed numbers, pranks, stress. None of it fit. None of it could explain the sound of my own voice speaking independently. I couldn't call anyone. They wouldn't understand. No one could. Not unless they'd heard it too, felt the sickening weight of someone else pretending to be you, perfectly, down to the tiniest quiver in your tone. And I knew it would come back, because the calls weren't random. They had a pattern, a time, a schedule, and I could feel the pull, like gravity, telling me I couldn't ignore it. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't dare. I sat in the corner watching the phone and the mirror, waiting for 3:15. But when the clock ticked past it, nothing happened. I exhaled slowly, relief washing over me, only to feel it, the sense of being watched, as if my own shadow had taken on life and was breathing just behind me. And deep in the back of my mind, the echo of that voice lingered. I'm already here. I realized then that the mirror, the reflection, the voice, it wasn't just a call anymore. It was a bridge, a way for something or someone to step from the line into my life. I had no idea how, but I knew it was coming, and I didn't know if I would survive the next ring. By the fifth night, I realized I had stopped sleeping altogether. Not in the way that sometimes happens when you pull an all-nighter, blinking through the haze of exhaustion. No, this was a deep, gnawing wakefulness, as if my body itself refused rest, sensing a danger I could neither see nor name. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of the curtains in the wind, every distant hum from outside felt amplified, threatening. The calls had evolved. They were no longer confined to 3:15 a.m., no longer predictable, no longer bound to the safety of night. The phone could ring at any time, and each time it did, it felt like the world shifted slightly, like a shadow stretching into a corner where it didn't belong. That evening, I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. I told myself I needed to eat, to shower, to at least appear functional if anyone noticed. But each sound, the faucet dripping, the microwave humming, the occasional car engine outside, made my heart jump. The phone lay on the kitchen counter, face up, glowing faintly as if anticipating my fear. I had convinced myself that ignoring it would stop it, that if I refused to answer whatever it was, wouldn't find me. But by 10 p.m., anxiety had taken full control. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the device, and counted the seconds. My pulse thundered in my ears, and when the clock ticked past 11 p.m., I thought I might collapse from exhaustion. And then it rang. The sound was sharp and loud, cutting through the quiet like a knife. My fingers flew to the phone, trembling so violently I nearly dropped it. The caller ID glowed. My number. Every instinct screamed to throw it away, smash it, run. But I answered. Hello? I croaked, my voice almost unrecognizable even to me. Static. Thick, heavy, oppressive. Then a whisper, just audible. Alex. I froze, knuckles white around the phone. Who is this? There was no hesitation this time, no distortion, just my own voice, crisp, clear, perfectly echoing the way I had spoken in my room earlier that day. Only it was wrong. It didn't match my memory of myself. It carried a cold, knowing tone that made my skin crawl. It said, I see you. My stomach turned. See me? What do you want from me?" A pause, then laughter. Not the soft, nervous laughter of a human. Something hollow, echoing, distant. The static warped with it, bending the room around me. "You can't hide," it whispered. "You're awake, but you're not asleep. You can't sleep, can you?" I wanted to scream, to throw the phone, to smash the windows. My hands shook violently, my knees buckled. I fell to the floor, pressing my back against the cold tile, and tried to steady my breath, but the voice didn't stop. "I see everything," it said. "Every move you make, every thought you try to bury. I know your routines, your fears, your secret corners. I know the night you cried alone in the kitchen, the night you whispered to yourself in the dark." I remembered it. Every detail it spoke of was true. Every moment I thought I had kept private, it had mentioned. My heart pounded so violently I thought I might collapse. I had never felt so exposed, so small, as if some unseen hand had reached into my chest and squeezed. I don't understand," I whispered. "How do you know these things?" "Because I am you," it said again, softly, almost gently. "And because soon, you won't be." The line went dead. The phone, once a source of sound and terror, now felt heavy and lifeless in my hand. But the voice lingered, echoing in my skull, a phantom imprint of dread I couldn't escape. Sleep had become a cruel joke. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear whispers threading through the static in my mind even when the phone was silent. The edges of reality blurred. Day and night no longer mattered. Shadows seemed longer, walls closer. Even in daylight I felt watched, as though the world itself had shifted and I had been left behind. I tried to distract myself. I went for walks during the day, hoping movement, sunlight, and human contact would break the tension. But even then, the fear clung to me. Every passerby seemed to linger too long with their gaze. Every reflection in a shop window felt like another version of me staring back. By the third day without real sleep, exhaustion had taken a new form. It was not just fatigue, but a living weight pressing into my bones. I found myself speaking aloud to the empty room, as if saying the words might somehow push away the presence I felt at all times. "I'm not going to answer again," I muttered to myself one afternoon, gripping my phone tightly. But I couldn't convince myself. Every vibration, every ring made my heart jump like it was being dragged out of my chest. And I knew, deep in the pit of my gut, that the calls were no longer a game. They were a warning. By the fourth night, I was a husk of my former self. Dark under eyes, voice hoarse from whispering to no one, body trembling from a mixture of fear and caffeine as I tried to stay awake. The clock ticked past 3 a.m., and my pulse raced. My hand hovered over the phone, the tension in my shoulders so tight I could barely move. And when it rang, I flinched violently, but picked it up anyway. "Hello?" I croaked. The voice returned, clear, perfect, my own. "I told you not to answer," it said mockingly. I swallowed hard. I can't, I have to know." A pause. Then, "You will know soon enough. And when you do, you won't be able to look away. You won't be able to sleep. You will see me, and I will see you." The line went dead. I pressed the phone to my chest, my body shaking violently. Tears streamed down my face. I had no idea if the terror would ever stop. I had no idea if I would ever sleep again. The line between reality and the call had dissolved. And in that moment, I understood I was trapped in the sleepless nights forever. because the calls weren't random anymore. They didn't follow the rules of time or reason. They were a tide and I was adrift, powerless to resist. I curled up on the floor, pulling my knees to my chest and whispered into the darkness, "Please, just stop." But by the sixth night, exhaustion had become a constant companion, but it was no friend. It was a predator. My body ached in ways I couldn't remember, my muscles tense as if bracing for something I didn't understand. My eyes had grown red and raw from staring at shadows in my room, listening for the familiar, dreaded ring. I had stopped trying to explain it to anyone. Friends, co-workers, even family, all would have dismissed me as delusional. Who would believe that a phone could call you from your own number? That a voice, your own voice, could speak independently of you, knowing your most private secrets? They would have laughed or worried about my sanity, but they didn't need to know, because no one could help me. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, the phone glowing faintly in the dark, like a lure. The clock ticked past 3 a.m., and my heart raced, my pulse a deafening drum in my ears. I felt it before I even saw it, a presence. Not something I could touch, but something I could feel in the air, heavy and watching, brushing against my skin like cold fingers. And then it rang. The phone's vibration rattled against the nightstand, a violent, insistent sound that made me flinch. I picked it up with trembling hands. My thumb hovered over the answer button. My mind screamed at me to throw the phone across the room, but my curiosity, that terrible, dangerous curiosity, won. I swiped. "Hello?" I croaked. My voice trembled, cracked, weak. Static. Heavy, oppressive, alive. Then, a whisper, familiar and horrifying. "Alex." I froze. The voice was softer this time, closer, like it was leaning into my ear. I realized I wasn't holding the phone to my ear anymore. I could hear it around me, in the room. And then the footsteps started. Light, deliberate, outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, straining to listen. Another step, another. The floorboards creaked softly under the weight of someone or something moving. My heart threatened to burst from my chest. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible, shaking. Silence. Then the phone crackled, the line alive with static again, and through the noise, the voice, my voice, spoke. "I'm already inside." The words hit me like a punch. I stumbled backward, my body shaking violently. My eyes darted around the room, desperate to see, but the room was empty, or so it seemed. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but I was rooted to the spot. Something about the voice, the way it sounded like me, yet not me, made me unable to move. I felt trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Another step. Closer. I realized it wasn't just footsteps now. It was something heavier, a shifting of air, a presence that pressed against the room's walls. I could feel it in my bones, in the hair on the back of my neck. I grabbed the phone again, pressing it to my ear as if it could protect me. "Who are you?" Static. And then the voice, calm, deliberate, chilling. "Don't you recognize me?" I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. No, I don't. Please, just go away." A laugh, low and hollow, echoed through the room. Not through the phone this time. It came from behind me. I spun around. Nothing. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, stretching toward me like long fingers. I backed against the wall, chest heaving. The footsteps came again, stopping just outside my door. My skin crawled. I could hear the faintest creak as if someone or something was testing the floorboards, pacing, measuring. The phone rang again. I picked it up, trembling violently, pressing it to my ear as if it could protect me. Alex. Closer. The voice was whispering, almost next to my ear. My blood ran cold. I've been waiting. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran from the room, phone clutched to my chest, heart hammering so violently I thought it might burst. My bedroom door slammed behind me, and I could still hear it. Steps, whispers, the voice, everywhere at once. I reached the kitchen, trying to steady my shaking hands. My reflection in the darkened window caught my eye, and then I saw it. A figure. At first I thought it was a trick of the shadows, but no. There, in the reflection, someone stood behind me. Not fully visible, but enough to see the outline. A person. Me. Not a reflection. Not a shadow. A duplicate. I spun around. Nothing. Empty room. Just walls, furniture, the faint glow of the refrigerator light. But the phone. It rang again. I answered, voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The voice was calm now, teasing, perfectly matching mine. "To see if you're ready." A chill swept over me. My knees buckled. The footsteps were closer now, circling the room. I could feel the weight of someone or something moving behind me, pacing, listening, waiting. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs refused. I was paralyzed, my mind reeling. By the seventh night, I had reached a breaking point. Sleep no longer existed for me. Daylight had become a blur, just another space in which I counted the hours until darkness and the inevitable ring. My body ached. My thoughts looped endlessly around the same horrifying cycle. The calls, the voice, the footsteps, the mirror. And, most terrifying of all, the certainty that whatever this was, it wasn't bound by logic or distance. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't face this alone. The first step was the phone company. Surely they could explain it. I dialed, voice trembling, trying to keep it steady. "Yes, hello. I'm receiving calls from my own number. I need help. This isn't a joke." The voice on the line was polite, measured, professional. "Sir, we can check for technical issues. Can you confirm your number?" I gave it, and then explained everything. My words tumbled out, frantic, chaotic. The strange calls at night, the voice, the things it knew, the footsteps, the mirror, and, most terrifying of all, the certainty that whatever this was, it wasn't bound by logic or distance. There was a long pause. "Sir, it's technically impossible to call your own number through our systems. Any call you receive from your number is either spoofed, which is illegal, or a glitch." "I know it's impossible," I snapped. "But it's happening. Please, I'm begging you, check it." Another pause. "We've checked, there's no anomaly. Your number is not calling itself. Sir, if this continues, you may want to consider speaking with the authorities or a mental health professional." I hung up, heart hammering. Authorities? Mental health professional? They would think I was crazy, but I had no other choice. The next step was the police. I explained the situation as calmly as I could, though every word felt like it was cracking under my fear. "I'm receiving calls from my own number," I told them. "Someone or something is using it to terrorize me. I don't know how. I've recorded one of the calls." They asked me to play the recording. I hesitated. The static, the whispers, the faint voice that sounded like me. I pressed play. The officer listened, frowning. This is unusual. Sounds like interference, maybe some kind of prank. We can file a report, but there's not much we can do technically." I felt my stomach drop. Not much we can do. "You might consider a restraining order if you suspect someone. But again, we can't prove anything criminal just from a phone line." I hung up, feeling smaller than ever. The world had not prepared me for something that defied rules, something that wasn't human. Desperation drove me to the last option, a paranormal investigator. I had been skeptical, sure, but at this point I'd try anything. The investigator arrived the next day, a tall man with pale eyes that seemed to look right through me, and a calm presence that both terrified and reassured me. He set up cameras, EMF detectors, and other strange devices I barely understood. "You're dealing with an entity that isn't bound by conventional technology," he said quietly. "It's using the phone as a bridge. The calls, the voice, it's probing, learning, testing boundaries. And from what you've described, it's growing bolder." "Bolder?" I asked, voice shaking. It's in my house. I hear it, see it." "Yes," he said, "and it's feeding on fear. The more you panic, the stronger it becomes. But it's not entirely invincible. There are ways to protect yourself. Rules, boundaries, rituals. Nothing guarantees complete safety, but they can buy you time." I swallowed hard. Time? Time for what? To understand it, or for it to find a permanent way into your reality. Sometimes these things begin with the phone call. They escalate. They test your limits. They want acknowledgement, recognition, engagement. I shivered. Recognition, engagement. Every word he spoke mirrored the terror that had lodged itself in my chest. That night, I tried to follow his advice, whatever it was. I avoided the phone as best I could, turned it face down, even put it in another room. I whispered prayers I barely believed in. I tried to meditate, focus my mind on rationality. But 3:15 a.m. found me awake, trembling, staring at the darkened phone from across the room. And then it rang. I didn't move. My hands were icy, my breath shallow. But I didn't answer. Not this time. The static came anyway, faint, almost teasing, as if it knew I could hear it without the phone. Then, whispering, my own voice, "Why are you hiding?" I pressed my hands to my ears, rocking gently, muttering to myself, "I'm not answering. I'm not answering. I'm not answering." The room grew colder. Shadows shifted. I could feel the weight of it moving around me, closer, pressing in from the corners. "Alex." The voice was patient, mocking. It wasn't screaming, it wasn't rushing, it was confident. And in that confidence I realized something horrifying. It was learning, growing stronger because I had engaged it with fear before. I whispered to myself, trying to steady my thoughts. "Do not answer. Do not answer. Do not answer." Hours passed. I don't know how. I don't remember. The first light of dawn seeped through the blinds, and I felt weaker. Not physically, mentally, emotionally. Like every night spent awake, every moment of fear was a hand tearing away at the very fabric of me. The investigator's words returned to me, haunting. It's probing, learning, testing boundaries. I understood now that seeking help hadn't ended the nightmare. It hadn't even slowed it. I had been trying to fight this with rules and devices and people who could not understand. It would not stop. And the longer I stayed awake, the more I feared what the next call would bring. I glanced at the phone on the counter. My number glowed faintly, screen dark but alive. My hand itched toward it, but I didn't move. I couldn't. Because somewhere deep down I knew the next step would be inevitable. By the 8th night, I was unraveling. The exhaustion had become a living thing, gnawing at my bones, twisting my thoughts into knots that refused to untangle. My world had narrowed to one constant terror: the calls, the voice, the footsteps, the reflections, and now, something else, something worse. It had begun subtly at first, glimpses in mirrors that didn't match my movements, shadows stretching in impossible ways, reflections in windows showing someone or something standing just behind me when I was alone. At first, I thought it was my imagination, stress, sleep deprivation, but I knew the truth. I was being watched. The phone rang that night at 3:15 a.m., of course. I didn't move. My hands shook violently, my chest heaving as I tried to steady my breathing. The ringing stopped, then a whisper. "Alex?" It was no longer coming solely from the phone. It was in the room. I could feel the vibration of it, the presence pressing against the air. I glanced around, eyes wide. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching unnaturally. My reflection in the window was wrong. It smiled. I didn't. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. The air felt thick, heavy, like swimming through honey. Every instinct screamed to run, to escape, to hide. But my legs wouldn't respond. My body was frozen. And then I saw it. A figure, thin and pale, standing in the corner of my room. Its outline mirrored mine perfectly, down to the tilt of the head, the slouch of my shoulders. My blood ran cold, my own shadow, or something worse. I shook violently, whispering, "This isn't real! This isn't real!" It stepped forward, slow, deliberate. Each step echoed faintly, though the floorboards didn't creak. My heart slammed against my ribs, deafening in my ears. "You've been awake too long," the voice said, perfectly my own. I can't. I've tried. I can't take this anymore." It tilted its head, the same gesture I make when I'm confused, when I hesitate. And then it smiled, my smile, but wrong, twisted, too sharp at the edges. "You can't hide from me." I stumbled backward, hitting the wall. My body trembled violently. I reached for the phone, desperate, but it lay on the bed, glowing faintly, like an anchor calling me. The ringing started again. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The figure moved closer. The shadows in the room stretched unnaturally as it crossed the floor. I could feel the air grow colder, my breath visible in ragged puffs. My reflection in the window now perfectly mirrored the figure, not me. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered. My voice broke. "It's your own fear," it said softly, almost soothing. "Every moment you stayed awake, every tremor, every whispered prayer, it fed me. And now I am strong. Stronger than before. Stronger than you." I dropped to the floor, hands over my head, rocking gently. The room felt alive, pressing in, bending around me. I wanted to close my eyes, but I was terrified of what I'd see when I opened them again. Then it spoke again. "You called me first." I shook my head violently. "No, I didn't." "You did," it said. "The first time, when you answered the phone. That was an invitation, a bridge. And now, I am here." I wanted to run, but the figure blocked the way. Not physically, but in a way that made my mind falter. Every step I tried to take felt like moving through water, slow and resisted. I screamed, voice echoing against the walls, my own voice, and the other voice perfectly mirrored, answered, "Yes, scream. It strengthens me." I clawed at the air, at the shadows, at the floor, at anything to push away the presence. The room seemed to tilt, the walls pressed closer, the floor buckled slightly, as though reality itself was bending. Then it spoke softly, almost tenderly. "You're tired. You've been awake too long. Let me in. Let me help you sleep." Sleep, the word twisted in my mind. It had always been my refuge, and now it was a weapon. I shook violently, trying to fight, but my strength was fading. My mind, frayed and raw, began to slip. I felt cold fingers brush against my arm. My arm! My heart leapt. I looked down. Nothing. The shadows clung closer. The phone rang again. I didn't answer. The figure stepped even closer, until I could feel its presence pressing against my chest. My reflection in the window now merged with it, an indistinguishable blend of me and something else. I whispered, voice trembling, I can't. It's okay, it said. Perfect. Soothing. Wrong. You don't have to fight anymore. Let me in. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just a call. It wasn't just a voice. It wasn't just fear. It was a being, growing, learning, feeding off my terror, ready to cross the final boundary. I pressed my hands over my face, trying to shut it out, to escape, to believe it was impossible. But I could feel it. I could feel it. Not through the phone, not through shadows, through me. Deep inside, in my bones. It whispered again, I am you. I am here. I am real. And for the first time, I realized I might not survive this encounter with my own reflection. The line between reality and nightmare had shattered completely. The calls had stopped being just calls. They had become a presence. And it was patient. It was waiting. And I was trapped. After the 8th night, nothing felt real anymore. The days blurred into nights, the nights stretched endlessly, and the phone never left my thoughts. I could feel it vibrating even when it lay silent across the room, glowing faintly like an ominous pulse that reminded me I wasn't alone. By the 9th night, I understood the terrifying truth. The calls were no longer just voices. They were an intrusion, a bridge, a doorway. The thing that had haunted me from the phone, the figure in the shadows, the mirror's twisted reflection, whatever it was crossing the threshold into my reality. I spent the day pacing, talking to myself, trying to organize my thoughts. Food had become irrelevant, sleep impossible. Every sound, every movement in the house felt like a warning. I could hear faint whispers almost below the threshold of hearing, repeating my name, echoing from walls, floors, ceilings. By evening, I had barricaded my bedroom door as best I could with furniture. I set candles around the room, not for light, but because the investigator had mentioned that some entities were sensitive to fire or light. I didn't know if it would help, but I needed something. At 3:15 a.m., the phone rang, of course. My hands shook violently as I stared at it, frozen. I didn't answer. The ringing continued for what felt like hours, though in reality it was probably only seconds. The sound echoed through the house, bouncing off walls, reverberating like a pulse of malice. Then the whispers began. First soft, barely audible. Alex, Alex, Alex. Then louder, overlapping as if dozens of voices, or one voice in many layers, were filling the room. And then the figure appeared. Not in the mirror, not in a reflection, in the room. I froze. It stood in the corner, exactly as before, shadowed and pale, mimicking my posture, my tilt, my subtle gestures. And now it moved. Step by deliberate step, it approached, gliding across the floor as if the air itself carried it. I backed against the wall, heart hammering. No, stay away, I can't. You invited me, it said, voice perfect, identical to my own. The first call. You opened the door. I screamed, voice cracking, hands flailing. The figure stopped momentarily, tilting its head. Then it moved again, closer. The air grew colder, thick, almost viscous, like I was wading through an invisible fog. My phone rang again. I didn't answer. The sound felt malicious now, a summoning, not a simple ring. And then I realized the most terrifying truth. It wasn't the phone that was calling me. I was being called. The entity spoke again, soft now, almost a whisper directly into my mind. I am here. I am real. I am you. I collapsed to the floor, pressing my hands to my head, rocking back and forth. I couldn't look at it. I couldn't look at the shadow that had become flesh, at the figure that mimicked every movement, every breath I took. My reflection in the window now perfectly mirrored the figure, and I could see my own terrified self trapped behind it, screaming silently. I understood then that the threshold had been crossed. It didn't content being a voice anymore. It wanted me. It wanted to exist through me, in my space, in my life. And the calls, the nights without sleep, the shadows, the whispers, they were merely the warm-up. I tried to reason with it, speaking aloud, desperate. I won't let you take me. You already did, it said softly. Every thought, every fear, every trembling heartbeat, it feeds me. And now I am stronger. Stronger than you, stronger than your world. I felt the walls close in, the floor beneath me vibrating slightly as if reality itself was responding to its presence. Shadows shifted unnaturally. My own reflection moved independently, smiling when I didn't. The air burned with cold. I could hear whispers everywhere now, not just my name. Memories I had kept secret, conversations I hadn't shared with anyone. My childhood fears, my adult failures, my guilt, my shame, all echoed in that voice, twisting in the static that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. I realized that fighting it in the way that I had before, running, hiding, barricading, was useless. It had crossed the threshold. It didn't just occupy my room anymore. It occupied my mind. My thoughts, my memories, even my perception of time and space were no longer entirely my own. I tried to stand, to face it, to confront it. Who are you? I whispered. I am you, it said again. And I am here. Forever. Unless you accept me. Unless you join me. The finality of those words crushed me. My body went cold, my knees buckled, and I fell to the floor again. I could feel the presence pressing into my chest now, not just in the room, but in my mind, in my very being. It extended a hand toward me, or perhaps it was my own hand stretched out from the shadow. I flinched, terror rooting me to the floor. Join me, it seemed to say. And for the first time, I realized it wasn't merely trying to scare me. It wanted to merge with me, to consume me, to exist as me. I screamed again, raw and primal, but the walls swallowed it. The phone rang once more, bright and insistent. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The entity stepped closer, its presence suffocating. My reflection, the shadow, the thing that was me but not me, it all merged into one terrifying vision. My world was no longer mine. Every boundary I had believed existed between reality and nightmare had been shattered. I understood then. The calls, the nights without sleep, the shadows, the whispers, they were merely the threshold. And I had crossed it. I curled into a ball on the floor, sobbing quietly, rocking myself, whispering, "Please go away, leave me alone." But it didn't. It wasn't going anywhere. It had crossed the threshold, and I was trapped. By the 10th night, I realized that desperation alone wasn't enough. The calls, the shadows, the mirrored figure, they had become a constant, looming presence. They didn't just invade my nights anymore. They intruded into my thoughts, my perception, my very being. Sleep was impossible. Eating had become mechanical. Breathing felt heavy, like every inhale carried their weight with it. I knew I needed more than prayers, barricades, or fleeing from the phone. I needed answers. The paranormal investigator returned, bringing an arsenal of equipment I barely understood. EMF detectors, infrared cameras, motion sensors, even archaic tools he claimed could ward off spiritual intrusion. I let him set up the devices throughout the house, placing them in hallways, corners, and near mirrors, the places where the entity seemed strongest. He was quiet at first, observing me and the room. "It's not just a haunting or a prank," he said finally, voice low. "It's aware, intelligent. It interacts with you directly. It's testing you, learning, probing." "Learning?" I whispered, my voice raw. "Why me?" "Because you called first. Not literally, but when you answered, you opened a door. You acknowledged it. That acknowledgement gave it access. Most entities like this linger in the background. Yours crossed a threshold, and now it's stronger, adaptive, persistent." I shivered. What does that mean? How do I fight it?" "It doesn't respond like ordinary spirits," he explained. "Traditional methods, salt, candles, prayers, or temporary distractions, they can't stop it permanently. You need to understand it, observe it, document it. That is the only way to predict its behavior and potentially limit its influence." I nodded, swallowing hard. Observation had become my lifeline, though it terrified me. That night, I prepared. I placed the cameras strategically, connected them to a laptop, and set audio recorders near the phone and mirrors. I had a small notebook to document every detail: the time of the calls, the movements, the changes in shadows, the whispers. At exactly 3:15 a.m., the phone rang. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I held my breath and watched the laptop screen. The static-filled line blinked, then my own number appeared. I took a deep breath and pressed record. The phone crackled, and then I heard it. My voice, perfect and indistinguishable from my own. "Hello?" it said, mocking the way I had answered countless nights before. I gritted my teeth and whispered to the investigator in the corner of the room, "It's here again." He nodded silently, adjusting a sensor. "Let it speak. Record everything." The static intensified. I could hear faint whispers threading through it. My name, fragments of memories, private thoughts. And then it spoke again, clearly this time. "You're awake. Good. I like that." I froze, heart hammering. "What do you want?" I whispered. "To learn, to understand, to merge. You feed me." I shuddered. "Merge? Feed you? What are you?" A pause. Then, faintly, almost like a sigh, "I am you. I am the parts you hide, the fears you bury alone, the nights you cry alone. I am the bridge between your reality and what you refuse to see." The investigator leaned close, whispering in my ear, "It's probing the boundaries of your mind. Document how it speaks, how it moves, how it reacts to your behavior. Every detail matters." I nodded, unable to look away. The room was alive with its presence. Shadows bent unnaturally. My reflection in the window moved independently, tilting its head to mirror the entity's expression, not mine. My pulse hammered in my chest. It spoke again, soft, almost teasing. "Do you see me? Do you see how close I am? Do you feel how easily I step into your world?" I shivered violently. "Yes, I see. I feel." "Good. That's all I need." The line went silent. I didn't dare move for several moments. The figure in the corner, my shadow, my reflection, my double, stood perfectly still. The air vibrated faintly, charged with an unseen energy. I realized that it had learned how to appear and disappear at will, how to manipulate shadows and perception. The investigator spoke quietly, almost reverently. It's more than a spirit. It's a consciousness. It grows stronger each time it is acknowledged. Every reaction, every moment of fear strengthens its presence. I pressed my hands to my head, rocking back and forth. I whispered, "How do I stop it?" "You can't stop it completely," he said. "Not yet. You can only slow it, manage it, survive it. Observation, documentation, and boundaries are your tools. Learn its patterns, understand its behavior, and stay awake." I felt the weight of that word, stay awake. I had been awake for nearly 10 nights now. My body was breaking, my mind fraying. But sleep was more dangerous than any exhaustion. It allowed it to invade more fully, to merge closer, to cross boundaries I couldn't defend. The next hours passed in tense silence. The phone remained quiet, the shadows still, the room seemingly empty. But I knew better. I could feel it watching, waiting, patient. It didn't need to make noise to terrify me. Its presence alone was enough. By the time dawn arrived, I had documented everything. Every whisper, every movement, every subtle shift in reality. I felt fragile, but slightly empowered. Knowledge, even partial, was my only weapon. And yet, deep down, I knew that the next night, the calls would return. The entity would push further, test me further, step closer to the line where it could exist fully in my reality. I had crossed the threshold, and there was no turning back. But I would learn. I would survive. Somehow. By the 11th night, exhaustion had fused with terror into something that felt permanent. Sleep was a concept I could barely recall. The phone, my own number, the voice, it wasn't just haunting me anymore. It had become a predator, patient and methodical, crossing boundaries I hadn't even known existed. I had tried everything I could think of: observation, barricades, rituals, prayers, recording devices, the investigator's equipment. Each method offered only temporary relief. The entity had learned, adapted, and grew bolder. My nights were no longer just sleepless, they were a battlefield. I sat on the edge of my bed, the phone lying face up on the nightstand. The clock read 3:14 a.m. My hands shook violently as I tried to focus. 1 minute. 1 minute until it came. 1 minute before the next call, the next whisper, the next intrusion. The room was silent at first, too silent. Every shadow seemed stretched, distorted, ready to strike. And then it came. The vibration of the phone, faint at first, growing steadily until it seemed to pulse through the floor, the walls, my very bones. I didn't answer. My hand hovered inches above the device, frozen. The ringing stopped. Silence. And then the whispering began. Soft, indistinct, just beyond comprehension. But this time, it was closer. In the room. I froze. The shadow in the corner, the figure, my double, was visible again. Not just a reflection, not just a shadow. Real. Palpable. Its outline exact, every feature mimicking me perfectly. But its movements were smoother, deliberate, predatory. It stepped forward slowly, and I could feel the temperature drop, the air thicken. "You've lasted this long," it said, voice perfect, identical to mine. I admire persistence. I swallowed hard. What? What do you want?" My voice shook violently. "To complete the connection, to bridge the gap fully. You've allowed me to exist in pieces. Now it's time to merge, to touch, to feel. to occupy your reality completely. I staggered back, pressing myself against the wall. The shadow shifted unnaturally as it moved. My own reflection in the window now mirrored the figure, not me. And I realized with horror, the threshold wasn't just crossed, it had widened. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my legs refused. My body felt paralyzed, trapped between fear and disbelief. And then it happened. The figure extended a hand, not slowly, but deliberately. Closer, closer. My heart pounded so violently I thought it would explode. And then I felt it. A brush against my arm. Cold, heavy, real. Not a shadow, not imagined. I gasped, stumbling backward. My hands flew to my arm. I could feel the chill, the weight, the unnaturalness of it. "You feel that?" it whispered, perfectly mirroring my panic. "You feel me?" Yes, I stammered, voice cracking. I feel you." "It's only the beginning," it said. Its hand lingered, pressing against my skin like an anchor. My mind reeled, my heart raced. Fear and disbelief collided, and I understood. It could interact physically now. The entity was no longer confined to voice or shadow. It could reach, touch, invade my space in ways I had never anticipated. I pressed my back against the wall, shaking violently. "Why? Why me?" it said. "You invited me." Every answer, every reaction, every fear, you fed the connection. You crossed the threshold, and now you can't stop me. Not entirely, not alone. I could feel it moving along my arm, a presence that defied logic, cold, almost like ice, but heavier, denser, as if it were pressing not just against my skin, but into my bones. The phone rang suddenly, shattering the tense silence. I didn't answer. I couldn't. But the vibration made the air hum, echoing the entity's presence. It moved closer, circling me slowly, deliberately, mirroring every inch I tried to retreat. "Do you understand now?" it whispered. "This is real. I am real. I am here." I shivered violently, rocking back and forth, pressing my hands to my face. The room felt alive with its presence. My body shook violently, yet I could feel it observing, calculating, waiting. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time no longer mattered. The phone remained quiet for a while, but I knew it wouldn't stay silent. The entity had made the first physical contact. The threshold had fully been crossed. And the next step, I feared I might not survive. But I realized one thing. Knowledge and observation were my only tools. If I understood it, documented it, and remained aware, I might yet find a way to survive. I whispered to myself, I will survive. Somehow, I have to. The first contact had changed everything. There was no going back. And deep in the back of my mind, I knew the next night would be worse. By the 12th night, exhaustion had become a part of me, a living, pulsing weight that pressed on my shoulders and blurred the edges of reality. The entity, the thing that had haunted me, whispered to me, touched me, was no longer just a voice or shadow. It was fully present, fully aware, fully terrifying. I realized that observation alone would no longer suffice. Recording, documenting, barricading, all of it had bought time, but not safety. It had learned my patterns, anticipated my reactions, and now it was patient, deliberate, confident. It no longer needed to scare me. It wanted to dominate, to merge, to exist as me. I gathered the tools the investigator had suggested, along with every precaution I could think of. Salt, candles, mirrors, ancient symbols, protective amulets. I created a perimeter around my room. Every door, every window, every shadowed corner was a potential breach. I prepared mentally, rehearsing the confrontation I knew I couldn't avoid. The phone rang at exactly 3:15 a.m. I didn't move. My hands hovered over the edge of my desk. The investigators' devices hummed faintly, lights flickering. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse, alive, waiting. And then it appeared. The figure, my double, stood perfectly still in the corner, eyes locked on mine. "You're ready," it whispered, voice identical to mine. I have to stop this," I said aloud, though my voice trembled violently. "I can't let you take me." "It's already too late," it said softly, "but resistance is entertaining." I ignited the candles, forming a circle around myself. I spread salt along the perimeter, arranging mirrors to reflect every angle of the room. The investigator had warned me the entity could manipulate perception, bend shadows, and invade thoughts. This was my attempt to establish boundaries. The figure stepped closer. The air grew colder, heavier. I could feel its presence pressing against me, almost physically, though it hadn't yet touched me. The phone rang again. I ignored it. My hands hovered over the edge of my desk. The investigators' devices hummed faintly, lights flickering. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse, alive, waiting. And then it acted. I stepped outside the salt perimeter, placing the mirrors strategically to reflect the candle's light toward the figure. I recited aloud every protective invocation I had memorized, focusing not on fear, but on control. My voice grew stronger, steadier, as I maintained eye contact with the figure. It recoiled slightly, as if struck. The shadows twisted and writhed. The air itself seemed to resist, pressing against me, trying to pull me back. But I held my ground. "You won't take me," I said firmly. "I refuse you. You have no power here without my consent." The entity's form flickered, like static on a screen. Its perfect mimicry faltered. The voice wavered, repeating my own words mockingly but less confidently. I pressed on, stepping forward, advancing toward it with the candles and mirrors held high. "I acknowledge you exist, but I will not let you consume me. I will survive. You cannot enter fully. You cannot cross the final line." A scream, high-pitched and distorted, echoed through the room. The figure writhed, twisted, and then, suddenly, it vanished. The temperature returned to normal. The shadows relaxed. The phone lay silent. The oppressive weight in the room lifted, almost entirely. I sank to the floor, trembling, sweat and tears mingling. The confrontation had drained every ounce of strength I had. But I had done it. I had survived. For now. I knew it could return. I knew it would. But for the first time in 12 nights, I had established control, a boundary, a limit, and that limit had held. The sun rose slowly the next morning, washing the room in pale gold light. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, I felt the weight of exhaustion as a physical thing, not a psychological torment. My body ached in every joint. My eyes burned from staring at shadows, and my hands trembled from trembling for nights on end. But the oppressive presence, the figure, the voice, the creeping terror was gone. At least, I thought it was. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the phone on my nightstand. It was silent. It screened dark. My reflection in the window matched my movements, uncorrupted. The shadows fell naturally. The house no longer felt alive with an unseen energy pressing against every wall. For the first time in days, I felt a hint of relief. The investigator had returned at dawn, quiet as always. He surveyed the room, glancing at the salt lines, the mirrors, the candles. "You've done well," he said softly. "You established boundaries. You held the line. That's all anyone could ask of themselves in a situation like this. I nodded, voice hoarse. It's over? He hesitated. For now. It has been pushed back, contained, but I cannot guarantee permanence. You cross the threshold. That means it can return if it senses weakness or if it finds a new invitation. The vigilance cannot end completely. I swallowed hard, letting his words sink in. Vigilance. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sleep, though tempting, was a battlefield I might not survive if I allowed myself to drift too far into unconsciousness. Every instinct screamed that the entity would test me again, that it would probe, adapt, and try to break the boundaries I had established. I spent the day cleaning the room, removing the scattered candles, carefully storing away the mirrors and salt, all while keeping my senses alert. Every sound made my heart race. Every shadow prompted a jump of adrenaline. Yet, as I moved, I noticed subtle differences. The air felt lighter. The shadows fell as they should. There was no pulse of malevolent presence pressing against me. By evening, I allowed myself a cautious walk outside. The sunlight and fresh air were foreign after days confined indoors. I watched neighbors going about ordinary lives, completely unaware of the terror I had endured. I realized, with a strange mix of relief and sorrow, that the world continued, indifferent to the horrors that had invaded mine. That night, I prepared carefully. I left the phone in another room, unplugged as much as possible. I didn't barricade doors or light candles. I allowed normalcy to creep in, cautiously, tentatively. But I stayed awake, alert, listening for the slightest anomaly. Every creak, every shifting shadow, every hum of electronics made me tense. The clock ticked toward 3:15 a.m. I sat in silence, heart hammering. The room was quiet. My reflection matched me exactly. The shadows were natural. The phone remained dark and silent. And yet, the memory of the first contact, the weight of its hand on my arm, lingered in my mind. I shivered, not from cold, but from the memory of its presence, the knowledge that it could return if provoked or given the slightest invitation. The terror was not gone. It had only been held at bay. Sleep approached cautiously. I rested against the wall, eyes open, listening, alert, breathing slowly. Every instinct screamed for vigilance. The phone rang in my mind before it ever rang in reality. I had learned finally how to resist, to acknowledge without inviting, to survive. Over the following days, I adapted to a fragile routine: sleep in short bursts, careful observation, maintaining boundaries, noting anomalies. Every night the urge to check the phone, to watch shadows, to listen for whispers clawed at me. But I resisted. Every time I did, the oppressive weight in the air lessened slightly. The investigator visited periodically, noting my progress, offering guidance. You have established a strong pattern of resistance, but always remember, it's intelligent. It adapts. You must remain vigilant. Complacency is the only path to failure. I realized the truth of his words. Even in containment, even with boundaries, the entity was never truly gone. It was patient. It could wait. It could strike again. And now I knew what it took to survive: attention, caution, knowledge, and the refusal to give fear power over me. Weeks passed. Days blurred into nights. The phone never rang again. The figure never appeared. The whispers did not return. My reflection remained true. Shadows behaved naturally. And yet, in the back of my mind, I knew it lurked, patient, waiting, learning. I returned to ordinary life gradually. Work, friends, routines. No one could know the horror I had faced. They would dismiss it as delusion, stress, exhaustion. And perhaps they were right in a sense. Perhaps it was beyond explanation, beyond understanding. But I knew the truth. I had survived, and survival had given me a strange resilience, a knowledge of fear unlike any other. The phone remained on the counter, silent. I did not touch it unnecessarily. I did not answer unexpected calls. I had established rules, and I followed them meticulously. I understood that even a small lapse could undo everything. At night sometimes, I would glance at the mirrors, at the shadows, at my reflection in the window. Nothing moved. Everything appeared normal. But I would always feel the weight of its gaze in memory, a lingering awareness that it was patient, waiting, and intelligent. And so I lived with vigilance, with constant awareness, carrying the memory of 12 nights of terror, the first contact, the confrontation, and the fragile victory I had achieved. The phone remained dark, the shadows remained natural, the voice remained silent. But I knew better. I knew that horror could return, that terror could find a way if the boundaries slipped. I had survived. I had confronted the entity. I had fought and established control. But survival was not freedom. Survival was awareness, vigilance, and the knowledge that some horrors never truly leave. They simply wait for the right moment. Weeks had passed since the confrontation, yet the unease never fully left me. My nights were quieter, my sleep slightly more restful, but the terror of what had occurred lingered in the corners of my mind like a shadow that refused to dissipate. Even with the phone untouched, the mirrors cleared, and the candles gone, I felt its presence, subtle, patient, waiting. The first indication came on an ordinary Tuesday. I was at work, sitting at my desk, the hum of fluorescent lights above me. I noticed something unusual. My computer screen flickered for a fraction of a second, and I thought I saw a shadow move in the reflection behind me. Heart hammering, I spun around. Nothing. Just empty office cubicles, fluorescent lights humming, the usual quiet murmur of colleagues. I tried to dismiss it. Stress, fatigue, paranoia. But it wasn't the first time something odd had happened since the confrontation. Small anomalies began accumulating. Whispers in empty rooms, fleeting shadows at the edge of my vision, reflections that lingered too long. My boundaries, though intact, had not erased its presence entirely. At home, I double-checked everything. Mirrors, windows, electronics. Nothing seemed amiss. But I felt it. The subtle pressure of awareness, the faint sensation of being watched, even when alone. I could feel its intelligence probing, searching for cracks, testing the limits of the boundaries I had imposed. One night the phone vibrated faintly, not ringing, not lighting up, but a soft, persistent hum. My heart leapt. I didn't touch it. I grabbed the notebook I kept, scribbling observations. Phone hums at 2:43 a.m. No screen activity. Shadows in bedroom corners elongate slightly. Temperature drops 1 degree. The entity was clever, patient. It had been pushed back, yes, but it had not left. It had adapted, finding subtler ways to assert itself without crossing the lines I had established. It was a lingering threat, a predator that could wait indefinitely for an opening. I contacted the investigator again, desperate for guidance. He came the following evening, setting up new protective measures, specialized symbols, electronic disruptors, and additional monitoring devices. "It's still testing you," he explained. "It has adapted to your boundaries. You survived before because you were strong. Now you must remain stronger. Vigilance must continue even if you think the danger has passed." I nodded, but inside I felt the weight of despair. Sleep had become a luxury I could not afford, and each day was colored by subtle anxiety. My hands shook slightly when I touched the phone. I avoided mirrors, preferring reflections in windows instead. Every shadow, every flicker of light, every faint hum in the house became a test of control. The most disturbing incident occurred at 3:15 a.m., as always. I was awake, cautiously observing the room, when the whisper came. Not through the phone, not through shadows, but in my mind. "You cannot ignore me forever. I am here, waiting." I froze. The voice, my own, echoed with a resonance that made the hairs on my arms rise. I clenched my fists, repeating protective words out loud. The room remained physically empty, yet the sensation of presence pressed against me with terrifying intensity. It was a reminder. Survival had not ended the threat, it had only delayed it. For the next few nights, I remained vigilant. The hums continued, shadows flickered, subtle disturbances grew more frequent. I realized that the entity had evolved from a direct, terrifying predator to a silent, insidious force, capable of testing my mind without physical interaction. The rules had changed. Survival required not only vigilance, but constant awareness, mental fortitude, and preparation. I documented everything meticulously, noting patterns, anomalies, and shifts in perception. The entity seemed to respect the boundaries still, but it learned, adapted, and pressed subtly, probing for openings in my attention, in my defenses, in my sanity. I realized the unsettling truth. It was not gone. It could return at any time. It could step across the threshold again. My life would never be entirely my own. The entity had become a part of my reality, a lurking intelligence that would exist in the spaces I could not see or fully control. And yet, despite the lingering terror, I also recognized my resilience. I had survived its first onslaught. I had established boundaries. I had learned its patterns. The lingering threat was real, yes, but so was my ability to face it, to remain vigilant, and to survive another night, another week, perhaps indefinitely. I lay awake that night, listening to the quiet hum of the house, feeling the subtle press of awareness in the air. The phone remained silent, the shadows normal, the mirrors clear, and I understood fully. The battle was not over, but I was no longer powerless. I had survived. I had learned. The lingering threat remained, but so did I.
Life, or at least the semblance of it, slowly returned. The lingering threat of the entity remained in the back of my mind, a constant shadow at the edge of my awareness, but I had established a fragile equilibrium. Boundaries, vigilance, and meticulous observation had allowed me to reclaim some portion of normality, though it was forever altered. The first few weeks after the last encounter were the hardest. Sleep came only in short bursts, each awakening a battle with fear and instinct. My reflection in mirrors, once a source of terror, became a test of my resolve. Shadows no longer moved independently, yet I caught myself flinching at the slightest flicker of light. Every phone call, even from familiar numbers, sent a spike of adrenaline through me. Work provided some distraction. Sitting at my desk among colleagues, observing the mundane flow of life, emails, meetings, coffee breaks, felt almost foreign. Ordinary problems suddenly seemed trivial compared to the battles I had fought nightly. Yet the stress of daily life reminded me that vigilance could not be abandoned. I had learned that even the smallest lapse could provide the entity an opportunity to intrude once more. I established routines designed to protect me without controlling every aspect of my life. Salt lines and candles remained only as a backup, mirrors were covered when not in use, and the phone stayed unplugged whenever possible. I avoided staying alone for extended periods, preferring the presence of friends or the investigator, who occasionally stopped by to monitor the situation. Every precaution was balanced against the necessity of living. Despite these measures, subtle reminders of the entity persisted. Sometimes a fleeting shadow in a hallway would make me pause, heart racing.
Sometimes the faint hum of electronics seemed to carry a resonance that felt deliberately intrusive. Occasionally I would hear a whisper, so faint it could be dismissed as imagination. But I knew better. The entity had not left, it had simply learned to remain patient, lurking at the edges of perception, waiting for any lapse in vigilance. Still, I refused to let it dominate my life. Slowly, cautiously, I reclaimed activities I had abandoned. I ventured outdoors, walked through parks, watched the sunlight dance across leaves without immediately scanning for shadows. I allowed myself moments of joy, laughter, and engagement with others. Yet even in these moments, my awareness remained heightened. I had learned that survival required balance, living fully while remaining mindful of the lurking danger. The most profound change was internal. I had learned to control my fear, to observe it without surrendering to it. I had learned to assert boundaries, both physical and psychological. The entity had forced me to confront the darkest corners of my mind, and in doing so, I had gained a resilience I could never have imagined. My awareness of fear, its patterns, its triggers, and my responses became a tool, a shield against further intrusion. Weeks became months. I returned to work with more confidence, though my sleep remained light and cautious. I allowed myself occasional solitude, always with contingency plans in place. Friends noticed my cautious habits, but accepted them without question. No one needed to know the full horror I had endured. No one could understand fully, and perhaps that was for the best. Occasionally, I revisited the notebook I had kept during the 12 Nights of Terror. The meticulous records, the observations, the patterns, all of it reminded me not only of what I had survived, but of the strategies that had allowed me to persist. I studied them regularly, refining my understanding, adjusting my routines, anticipating possible returns of the entity. Knowledge became a form of armor. One evening, months later, I sat by the window, watching the sunset. The shadows lengthened and shifted naturally across the room. The phone remained dark. My reflection, once a source of terror, was now simply my own. And yet, deep in the back of my mind, I knew the entity lingered, patient and intelligent, waiting for an opportunity to test me again. I felt a strange combination of fear and empowerment. The entity had not been destroyed, and perhaps it never could be, but I had survived its attempts to consume me, to merge with my reality, to dominate my mind. I had established boundaries, mastered vigilance, and regained control of my life, however fragile. I realized that living with this awareness was no longer a curse, but a condition I could navigate. The terror remained, yes, but so did my ability to respond. I had learned to coexist with the lurking presence, to assert my agency, and to survive even under extreme psychological pressure. The final lesson was clear. Survival was not about defeating the entity completely. It was about maintaining awareness, asserting boundaries, and refusing to surrender to fear. The phone could ring again, shadows could shift, whispers could return, and if they did, I was ready. I placed the notebook on my desk and unplugged the phone, letting it rest silently. The room was calm, shadows behaved naturally, and the reflection in the window mirrored my movements perfectly. And yet, deep in the back of my mind, I knew the entity lingered, patient and intelligent, waiting for any subtle intrusion. I reclaimed my life, cautiously, deliberately. I had established a fragile equilibrium between fear and survival. The entity, though never gone, had been contained within boundaries I could enforce. I understood the rules now. Vigilance, observation, and refusal to allow fear to dominate were essential to my continued survival. And so, with cautious optimism, I moved forward. I returned to the world, aware that the lurking threat persisted, yet confident in my ability to navigate it. Life, in its ordinary yet fragile beauty, continued around me. And I, forever changed, would continue to live with awareness,
vigilance, and the knowledge that some horrors never leave. They simply wait. The phone remained dark. The shadows were normal. And for now, I was safe. But I knew better than ever to fully trust the quiet. Life had settled into a tentative rhythm. Days flowed in a predictable pattern. Work consumed most of my attention, and evenings were filled with quiet routines that reminded me I was still alive. Yet, beneath the surface of normality, a subtle unease persisted. The entity had not returned in full force, not physically, not through the phone, but I could feel it lingering, patient, intelligent, waiting for the smallest opening. It started with whispers, faint, almost imperceptible, drifting just beyond the threshold of comprehension. At first, I dismissed them. Perhaps the wind, perhaps fatigue. But they were persistent. The whispers seemed to respond to my thoughts, trailing the edges of memory. Names, memories, fears I had long buried surfaced in soft, distorted tones. I could hear them even when the house was silent. The first truly disturbing occurrence happened one evening while I was preparing dinner. The knife clattered against the cutting board, and a whisper brushed against my consciousness. Remember. I froze, staring at the shadows that fell unnaturally across the kitchen floor. My pulse hammered. Nothing was visible, nothing tangible, yet the sensation of presence was undeniable. It was there, watching, testing, teasing. I spent hours afterward inspecting every corner, every reflective surface, every shadow. Nothing. But the unease remained, an invisible pressure pressing against my awareness. I realized with a sinking feeling that the entity had not truly been defeated. It had learned patience. It had adapted to boundaries. It was no longer reliant on fear alone. It could intrude subtly, leaving traces in perception, in memory, in the very way reality felt. Sleep had become more structured, but never deep. I slept in short intervals, waking at the faintest disturbance. Sometimes I would wake to the feeling of being observed, the weight of presence pressing against the edges of my mind. The phone remained dark, yet I instinctively left it unplugged at night, as if a simple connection could give it access. One morning, I awoke to find subtle anomalies. The furniture in my living room was slightly out of place, though I could swear I had arranged it the night before. The shadows from the window blinds stretched in unusual directions, bending slightly at angles that felt unnatural. The air was heavier, almost thick, though nothing had changed physically. And somewhere beneath my perception, a faint whisper echoed, "I am here." I began documenting these occurrences meticulously, much as I had during the nights of terror. Each anomaly, each whisper, each subtle shift in reality was recorded in a dedicated notebook. Patterns began to emerge. The entity seemed to move in cycles, increasing subtle pressure at certain times, testing my vigilance, gauging my reactions. It was no longer a predator that could be confronted head-on. It had become a persistent, psychological presence, lurking beneath the surface of everyday life. The investigator advised extreme caution. He visited periodically, installing sensors, testing environmental anomalies, and providing guidance. "It has changed," he explained. "It has adapted to your previous defenses. It no longer needs to make itself obvious. Subtlety is now its strength. You must remain aware at all times." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. Even in the absence of immediate terror, Survival was no longer a guarantee. Every thought, every lapse in attention could be exploited. The entity had evolved, becoming a master of persistence, an intelligence that could exist in the spaces I overlooked. One night, the whispers intensified. I was in the study, reviewing my notes, when I heard my name repeated in a distorted cadence. Alex, Alex, Alex. The sound seemed to drift not from any physical source, but from within my own mind. I pressed my hands to my ears, shaking, trying to block it. It persisted, overlapping with fragments of my own thoughts, twisting memories and fears into a cacophony of psychological pressure. I realized with horror that it could influence perception itself. Shadows appeared where none existed. Reflections lingered slightly longer than natural. Objects seemed to shift subtly when unobserved. I could not trust my senses entirely. Even my memory, my sense of self, felt vulnerable to manipulation. Desperation clawed at me. I attempted to sleep, to rest, to reclaim ordinary life, but the whispers followed. Every sound in the house was amplified. Every flicker of light, every hum of electricity felt like an invitation. I understood the cool genius of the entity. It had not needed to return in full. It had left traces, subtle fingerprints across my reality, teaching me that vigilance was permanent. Despite the terror, a strange resilience emerged. I had endured 12 nights of direct assault. I had established boundaries. I had learned the patterns, understood the rules, and mastered my fear. Now I had to adapt further, learning to live with a lingering presence, to coexist with it without succumbing to despair. Observation became both protection and burden, a constant mental exercise to anticipate and respond to the entity's subtle manipulations. The phone, still dark, remained a symbol of both past terror and potential threat. Mirrors, though normal, were no longer fully trusted. Shadows were scrutinized, reflections analyzed. The air itself, quiet and still, was approached with suspicion. Every aspect of my environment became a test of awareness, a reminder that survival required constant vigilance. Months passed. The subtle disturbances continued, sometimes imperceptible, sometimes jarring enough to make my pulse leap. Yet I persisted. I established routines that balanced caution with living. I ventured outdoors, engaged with friends, returned to work. The world appeared normal, indifferent to the hidden presence that haunted me. But I knew better. I had learned that some horrors never vanish. They simply adapt, wait, and exploit weakness. At night, as I lay awake, I could feel the whispers at the edge of perception. Sometimes I could catch phrases, fragments of memory, faint echoes of my own fears. The entity had not returned fully, but it had left itself embedded in reality, an unseen, insidious presence that could intrude without warning. I realized that life would never be the same. Survival was not freedom. It was a delicate balance, an ongoing battle against perception, memory, and awareness. The entity had left traces that could never be fully erased. And yet, in the midst of terror, I also understood my strength. I had endured. I had survived. I had adapted. The unseen whispers continued, subtle, intelligent, patient. But so did I. And that knowledge, fragile yet enduring, became my anchor, my lifeline in a world where some terrors never truly leave. They simply wait. The whispers had never stopped. Months after the confrontation, after weeks of careful vigilance, the entity still lingered, subtle, patient, insidious. It did not speak through the phone anymore, nor did it appear as a shadow or reflection. Instead, it existed in the small details of reality, in the flicker of light, the shifting of shadows, the faint hum of electronics. It was always just beyond perception, reminding me that it had not been defeated, only contained. I had grown cautious, disciplined, and hyper-aware. My days were carefully structured. My nights were battles of vigilance, brief periods of light sleep punctuated by constant monitoring. I moved through the world with the knowledge that at any moment the entity could exploit a lapse. It had become a part of my reality, a constant shadow on the edge of perception. One night, as I sat in my study reviewing notes and observations, I felt the familiar pressure in the air, a weight that was not tangible but undeniably present. I knew then that the entity was testing me again, probing for weakness. The whispers began faintly at first, almost imperceptible. "You cannot ignore me. I am here. Always." I gritted my teeth and repeated protective mantras aloud, tracing salt lines and checking mirrors. But this time, I felt a shift, something deeper, more deliberate. The entity was offering a choice, a challenge, a test of my will. It had grown intelligent beyond what I had anticipated. This was not merely a threat, it was a proposition. In my mind, I heard it clearly, perfectly mimicking my own thoughts. "Do you wish to survive fully, or risk everything to banish me?" I froze. The question, though unspoken aloud, resonated with an intensity that made my pulse race. Survival had come at a cost. Sleepless nights, constant vigilance, a life lived in subtle fear. But to attempt banishment would be to risk everything. The entity, my mind, my very existence. Yet to continue merely surviving felt like a cage, a prison forged by fear. I considered my options carefully. Survival meant living with the whispers, the subtle manipulations, the constant awareness. Attempting banishment meant confronting the entity directly, risking its full wrath, and possibly opening new thresholds I could not control. Either choice carried peril. The investigator had warned me of this possibility. Some entities could be contained but never truly destroyed. Attempts to exorcise or banish required extreme measures, rituals of immense complexity, and the risk of failure that could result in permanent possession or death. Yet he also said, "Sometimes courage is the only tool you have left. You must decide if the risk is worth it." I spent hours contemplating, reviewing my observations, retracing the events of the past months. I thought of the 12 nights of terror, the first contact, the lingering whispers, and the subtle distortions of reality that had persisted ever since. I realized that containment had allowed me to survive, but it had not freed me. The entity remained a shadow in my life, patient and intelligent, waiting for an opportunity to expand. Finally, I made a decision. I would confront it. Not recklessly, but with preparation, knowledge, and a willingness to risk everything. If I was to reclaim full control of my life, I could not remain in perpetual vigilance. I needed closure, or at least a definitive attempt at it. I prepared meticulously. Protective symbols, candles, mirrors, salt, and specialized equipment provided by the investigator were arranged in the room. I studied the patterns of its subtle intrusions, timing my actions to coincide with moments of heightened presence. I steeled my mind, repeating protective mantras and affirmations. Fear remained, but it was tempered by determination. I would face it on my terms. At precisely 3:15 a.m., I began the ritual. The room seemed to pulse with energy as I recited incantations, tracing symbols, focusing on boundaries I had learned to enforce over months of observation.
The air thickened, and a subtle vibration ran through the floor, walls, and ceiling. The whispers returned, faint at first, growing into distinct phrases. "You cannot stop me. You cannot banish me. I am eternal." I held my ground, voice steady despite the racing of my heart. "You exist only because I allow it. I reclaim control tonight." The pressure in the room increased, shadows twisting unnaturally, reflections elongating and distorting. The entity manifested, not fully visible, not tangible, but I could sense its awareness, its intelligence, its intent. It had become more patient, more cunning, but it could not yet cross the boundaries I had mastered. The ritual reached its peak. I focused entirely on the symbols, on the protective lines, on my own awareness. Every thought, every movement, every heartbeat was deliberate. The whispers crescendoed, then faltered. The air stilled, shadows returned to normal, and the subtle vibrations ceased. Silence enveloped the room, almost violently, as if reality itself held its breath. I exhaled slowly, heart pounding, sweat dripping from my temples. I had done it. The entity was contained, no, diminished. Whether permanently or temporarily, I could not know. But for the first time since the first call, I felt a measure of control that had been absent for months. I had chosen confrontation over perpetual vigilance, and I had survived. The aftermath was quiet but profound. The room remained normal, shadows behaved naturally, and the whispers no longer pressed against the edges of my mind. I could move freely, sleep without constant interruption, and live with the oppressive weight of unseen observation. Yet I knew the truth. Survival had required courage, preparation, and willingness to face the unknown. Even now, I remained vigilant, aware that the entity's intelligence could allow it to return if provoked or if I weakened. But I also understood that I had agency, the ability to confront fear directly, and the power to assert control over my reality. I placed the notebook, full of months of meticulous observation, on the desk. It was a record not only of terror, but of resilience, knowledge, and survival. The phone remained dark, shadows behaved naturally, and reflections mirrored my movements. I could finally breathe. And yet, a small part of me remained aware, alert, listening. The entity had been diminished, contained, but not entirely gone. Survival required vigilance, knowledge, and courage, and I had proven that I could wield all three. I had chosen to confront, to risk everything rather than remain a prisoner of perpetual fear. The choice had been terrifying, but necessary. And I knew, deep in the recesses of my mind, that vigilance would always remain. But so would my strength. I had survived. I had chosen. And that, I realized, was enough. Even as silence filled the room, I could feel a residual energy clinging to the edges of perception, subtle but undeniable. It was as though the entity had left behind fingerprints on reality itself, tiny distortions that reminded me it had existed here and could, if provoked, return. I examined the shadows, traced the lines of light across the walls, and listened to the faint hum of electronics. Everything seemed normal, yet my mind remained alert, trained to detect the slightest anomaly. I thought about what I had sacrificed to survive. Sleep came more easily now, but vigilance had become a permanent companion. Moments of joy were tinged with awareness. Quiet evenings, social interactions, and even laughter were shadowed by the knowledge that the entity was patient, intelligent, and relentless. I realized that freedom was no longer a complete state. It was conditional, always balanced against the need for caution and preparation. And yet, in that stillness, I also recognized a strange triumph. I had confronted the unknown, stared into a horror beyond comprehension, and emerged intact. My mind, once fractured by fear and sleepless nights, had grown resilient. I had learned to assert control over my reality, to impose boundaries, and to refuse terror its dominion over me. The choice I had made, risky, frightening, and uncertain, had reaffirmed my agency, proving that even in a world shadowed by persistent horror, courage and knowledge could carve out a space to survive. Life returned to a fragile normal. Shadows fell naturally, the phone remained silent, and mirrors reflected reality as they should. Yet I knew the entity had not vanished. It lingered subtly in the edges of perception, in faint whispers and fleeting anomalies. Survival had demanded vigilance, courage, and relentless awareness. I had learned to assert boundaries, observe patterns, and reclaim control over my own mind and environment. Though fear remained, it no longer ruled me. I moved through days with caution, nights with alertness, and a quiet resilience that had grown from months of confrontation. The entity's presence was a reminder that some horrors never fully leave. They adapt, wait, and test the boundaries of those who endure. But I had survived. I had confronted the unknown and emerged intact. And in that survival, I discovered the enduring truth. Courage, knowledge, and vigilance are the ultimate defenses against even the most patient darkness. Life returned to a fragile normal. Shadows fell naturally, the phone remained silent, and mirrors reflected reality as they should. Yet I knew the entity had not vanished. It lingered subtly in the edges of perception, in faint whispers and fleeting anomalies. Survival had demanded vigilance, courage, and relentless awareness. I had learned to assert boundaries, observe patterns, and reclaim control over my own mind and environment. Though fear remained, it no longer ruled me. I moved through days with caution, nights with alertness, and a quiet resilience that had grown from months of confrontation. The entity's presence was a reminder that some horrors never fully leave. They adapt, wait, and test the boundaries of those who endure. But I had survived. I had confronted the unknown and emerged intact. And in that survival, I discovered the enduring truth. Courage, knowledge, and vigilance are the ultimate defenses against even the most patient darkness.